So thank you everybody for joining our meeting tonight. The NWSOFA is an organization that is based in the Palatine area, but we cover 6 townships and basically have a membership of about 5,000 who gets our emails. And then these recordings, when they're posted, Bill keeps track of how many views we get, and typically it's in close to 2,000 views of these presentations. So it's a way to expand what we're doing. This is basically what we try to do is education. And we have Liliana Scales, who's advocacy director of Change Illinois, who's going to review what Change Illinois does, and we'll talk about the redistricting and census project. But let me tell you a little bit about NWSOFA. We're an issue group-based organization, and I'll just go around the snowflake that's on the right. Conversation Z was started by a young lady who's now a junior at Syracuse University, and it was to get Generation Z people registered to vote and interested in voting, interested in the election process. And even though she's at Syracuse University, she is still keeping that going. So if you know anybody that is in that Generation Z that would be interested in hearing about what she's doing, you can let us know. You can go to this link down here, nwsofa.org, and request membership in these different in our different issue groups. ACA is the Affordable Health Care Act, which we're still tracking. Immigration, that was a big issue, obviously, about a year ago when we had all those issues down at the border. Social justice and women's rights, basically a stand with women. That this is a group that supports the Equal Rights Amendment, and the Fiscal and Economics Group does a great presentation once a month. They take data that the federal government puts out, put it in charts so we can easily understand it, and show trend lines as to what's really happening with the economy or employment. Last week we did. They spent probably 15-20 minutes going through what the COVID has done to the economy and what is happening with that trend. Electoral information, climate change. We had a great meeting a couple nights ago on climate, talking about what is referred to, I don't know if you've heard about it, something called bomb trains. These are these long trains of tank cars that are filled with volatile petroleum, oil products, can be compressed natural gas, can sometimes be ammonia or even chlorine, which is, if it derails in a town, can be very dangerous. Restore Democracy is the group that's sponsoring this meeting tonight. So that's Ed Spire and myself, Jim McGrath. We're co-chairs for this group. We started out doing a lot of presentations on HR1 and to explain HR1, but when the COVID came along, we switched to supporting vote by mail, and we did a lot of presentations for people around the state on how to get your vote by mail ballot, because we were very concerned about people being concerned about COVID and maybe not going to vote because of that. So we hope we had some impact on increasing the number of people that voted by mail. And then the Gun Violence Prevention Group, it meets once a month. And this was one of our original groups that got NWSOFA started. The OFA, so NWS is Northwest Suburbs. We're northwest of Chicago. The OFA originally was Obama for America, and then when he got elected, his second term, the group decided let's keep going, and then we changed it to Organizing for Action. So we have for our issue groups and all of these communication groups over here, we have about 25 co-chairs or people that lead these different groups. And we're always looking for more, anybody else that's interested. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn this over to Liliana. And Liliana, it's all yours. You can go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining today and for being engaged and wanting to be informed in a process that's so important. The presentation we're going through, that I'll go through, will give you an understanding of what the process is like in Illinois, what the timelines are like, and really how you can get engaged and feel empowered to advocate to your own legislators about what's important in the redistricting process coming up. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to go through the presentation. Feel free to interject if you have a question on a particular slide, or we can also wait until the end. It's completely up to all of you. I don't want it to be so formal where I lose people, so please feel free to interject. I'm going to share my screen now and begin the presentation. The campaign that we're working on as an organization is called We Draw the Lines. I'll talk a little bit about our partnership with Representable. But essentially, this presentation will hopefully leave you feeling like you know exactly how to participate and advocate for your communities in the redistricting process. My name is Liliana, or Lily Scales. I have been with the organization for about 2 years and really work with community organizations on trying to get engaged members to act on in redistricting efforts that have in the past excluded Illinoisans. So for change, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit organization and have been working on redistricting for quite some time. And for those of you who followed some of our work in the last session, we were trying to pass an independent redistricting commission, an amendment to the Constitution, but it failed to reach the ballot. So we still are calling for transparency in the redistricting process and also calling for engagement from community. So that's kind of a background on the organization. So you all are probably more well-versed than the average person in Illinois, but I also don't want to assume anything. So let's talk about the definitions of what is redistricting and what does it mean. The title of the presentation or tonight's meeting is Gerrymandering Bad? Redistricting. So we'll get to that. So redistricting is the process that happens every 10 years where the government gathers population information through the census so that we can redistrict our electoral districts, our legislative districts, and really across the whole country does this. So every 10 years, redistricting happens. There's nothing bad about that process. Redistricting is not a bad word. It's a process that needs to be done every 10 years to ensure that our representation is reflective with the population shifts that we see. The redistricting process in Illinois is pretty straightforward. The legislators, and this is why I want you all to make sure that you understand who is in charge of this process. It's the legislators who end up drawing the maps for the state districts and all the legislative districts. If the maps are not approved by a simple majority, if they do get approved, they get sent to the governor for either approval or a veto. If the governor vetoes a map, then there is another step. So step 3 is if they don't agree on a map, then there is a commission that is chosen evenly split between the two majority parties, which are Democrats and Republicans in the state of Illinois. If those commissioners who are chosen by legislative leaders to be on that commission, if those folks do not agree on a map, then there is essentially a coin toss to determine which party would lead the remap process, essentially who would draw the maps. At the moment, in this timeline where we're at, we are waiting on census data to be released to the states so that we can use that information to determine the population shifts and how maps should be drawn.
Lily, do we have an idea of what direction that's going to go? I've heard that we're losing representation. Is that true?
It's absolutely true. We are losing representation predominantly in Black communities. And I can also send information with a study from UIC that tracks population loss specifically in denser communities like Chicago and communities that surround Chicago. But we're also waiting on census data that I think a lot of you who follow census information that it was a very difficult year to get an accurate count on the census, with the administration making it very difficult for folks who are undocumented to essentially count themselves in the census. And it was a collective effort throughout the state. And we were part of those efforts as well through Forefront and state efforts to get a complete count. So it'd be interesting to see what data the legislators will be using to redraw the maps. So what we're hearing right now is that redistricting data is not going to come out until July 30th, which would be after the state's deadline of June 30th to approve the maps. So we'll get into that. We'll get into that because every other week there's something different with the census. And I said it in the beginning that the census will continue to haunt us. And I think a lot of us who were working on trying to ensure that we were counting every single person that lived in Illinois found it very challenging, not just because of the administration's desire to exclude undocumented folks, but also the pandemic ended up hitting during really the middle part of the census collection that was going to be more door knocking and more robust, that we had to shift and do things differently. So as we wait for the census data, traditionally what these are the requirements that are for drawing the maps in Illinois. The maps must follow the Federal Voting Rights Act and the Illinois Voting Rights Act. They must be substantially equal in population. So essentially a district can't be, 20,000 more folks than another district. They have to generally be equal in population. And districts must be compact and contiguous. So you can't have a district that ends up breaking into another community. They have to be connected in its shape. Now, like I said, redistricting isn't the bad word. And when redistricting goes wrong, it is called gerrymandering. And that is what we're trying to combat, is the process of essentially stealing an election. For those of you who have talked about gerrymandering before, have seen this image, and the image shows how a red or a blue district can steal an election. So the first image on the left has 60% blue and 40% red voters, essentially. The middle district shows that if you cut up the districts in a way that will ensure that blue wins, that the red can also cut up districts in a way to ensure that red wins. I think it's important to note that in Illinois, we have a predominantly blue state, and there have been efforts across the country to help combat extreme partisan gerrymandering. But I think all of us who live in Chicago and live in Illinois and care deeply about Illinois, we've seen how districts get cut up to essentially protect incumbency and to choose voters instead of the other way around. So gerrymandering is just that. It's the practice of drawing the districts in a way that favors a political party. So partisan gerrymandering, which essentially has electeds choosing their voters and manipulating maps in a way that suppresses voters and leads to elections that are uncompetitive. And traditionally, the communities that end up hurting from this gerrymandering are communities of color and minority groups that don't have a voice in that process. So I have not, this is not like a dire situation, right? Because there is such appetite for folks to be involved and to advocate in a process that traditionally hasn't included community input. I can't see everyone, but I usually ask, raise your hand if you've ever been part of a redistricting process, if you've been at the tables, drawing the maps, helping inform communities. Usually none of us can raise our hand to say that we were in conversation with our legislators or we were providing community input within our communities to ensure that our neighborhoods weren't cut up into multiple districts. But it's really important that we do include community input because what we've seen in the past is that there are manipulations of map that end up cutting up communities and suppressing their ability to choose a candidate of their choosing or to have competitive elections. How we partner with ensuring that we're combating gerrymandering is by having folks draw their communities of interest. And a community of interest, it really depends on how people define it, but generally it's defined as a population that shares a similar interest, whether it's cultural, historical, demographic. Essentially, you're saying, this is the community I care about. This is how I define my community, and we believe that this community shouldn't be broken up. Here are some questions that you may ask to help define your community. Do you have a shared history? Do you have a same dependency on crops, for example? Do you have a shared language or cultural traditions? Or are there natural boundaries that define your community? And the way really that communities of interest combat gerrymandering is that communities themselves end up identifying their communities to say, like I mentioned, that when you're defining when a community are defining their own communities instead of demographers, assuming that this district may have similar interests, and not knowing that there may be two different communities or two communities that share a very distinct language or cultural background, that they may not consider themselves in the same community. So it's important to highlight that the communities of interest have to be defined by communities, and that we cannot assume that we know, and by we, map makers cannot assume that they know the communities of interest when they go and draw the maps. In Illinois, they don't, the legislators or demographers don't have to include communities of interest in drawing maps. And generally, there are three ways that map makers should consider or do consider communities of interest. They can either ignore the communities of interest, they can define the communities of interest and not necessarily live in that community, and most of the time they don't live in that community. Or what we're really hoping and pushing for is that communities define their own communities of interest, and then the map drawers listen and respect that input. So the partnership that we are aligned with is called Representable. For those of you who follow redistricting news across the country, this is also a tool that was partnered in Michigan and Virginia. And essentially, it is a tool that asks questions of folks to draw their community of interest maps. This is not to be confused with drawing districts. This isn't about trying to get folks to determine what their legislative districts are. This is to say, whatever the process will be at the state level, this is the community I care about. Don't break it up. And if there are, a lot of folks who are submitting community of interest maps, they can end up defining that effort and advocate and really ensure that when it's time for the legislators to draw the maps, that they keep their communities intact. This is a free tool. It's out of the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, and it's a pretty self-responsive tool. They just went through a interface change, so it made it fairly simple, I would say. There are barriers for translation. So if folks need the tool translating in a different language, they're working on Spanish and Arabic, I believe. But that I would say is a barrier for accessibility, depending on the communities that you all reside in and what you determine may be another need for language access. But we're going to kind of walk through the form. The first part of as soon as you go onto the representable.org, the website is on the bottom here, /drive/we draw the lines. You fill out your name, your street, city, state, zip code. Then you'll get this next page where it defines your community of interest, and it defines community of interest for you so that you can determine how you're drawing your community. Again, is it a shared cultural, historical, or economic interest? You want to make sure you keep intact. There are a couple questions and drop-down buttons that you will have to select and answer to help direct what defines your community of interest. And then next page will ask you to name your community. So depending on where you live or how you define your community, you just plug in whatever that name is. And then you get prompted to this screen. You can either add your zip code or your home address or whatever address you're drawing a community of interest map for, and it zooms into that location. And it ends up taking census blocks. So as you select your neighborhood, or the community that you define, it's selecting census blocks, and that's the data that's used for this tool. There is a privacy and terms use at the end. Representable wants to ensure that there are real people that are completing community of interest maps, and also ensure that you're not a robot or nothing nefarious is happening with the drawings of communities of interest. And then you end up getting a message. I don't have that screen, so I apologize. You end up getting a message that says, congratulations, you completed your community of interest map, and you're able to download that data in a PDF. You're able to also download that in a GeoJSON, which that is a format that you can layer to an actual map making tool like Districtar or Days Redistricting. And I'll send those links so that you are able to use both of those links. Map drawing links are also free. The representable tool, like I said, is not drawing the legislative districts or your community districts. It is just drawing the community of interest to ensure that we keep those intact when it's time to redistrict the state. So you also the data that you receive can also be downloaded in a PDF form. Like I mentioned, and that information can be submitted to your legislator. You can say, hey, everyone that lives in Peoria, we have 100 maps out of Peoria, and this is how we defined this community. And if you have those folks reaching out to their legislators, it really could be a powerful tool in a process that, again, has not taken community input into account in the past. I also have this website here, which is on Change Illinois, where you're able to look up your legislator if you don't know, or you can share this link to folks so that when they do draw their communities of interest, they know who to speak to and have that information handy. And then I added our information here, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second just so I can share something else. And as I do that, feel free, if anyone has any immediate questions, to send that to me.
Lily, you said we're not gonna get the census data till after, by Illinois law, the maps are supposed to be done. What happens in the legislature at that point?
Well, I think they're talking about using last year's census data, right? Or the last year's estimates.
Yeah, so I think that's what we're also trying to track and ask. What data is being used? And if it's last year's data, we're going to see, I think, different groups be not thrilled about that, because I shouldn't say last census data, and that was 10 years ago. There's been substantial changes in population and shifts. There's been a higher population increase with Latino communities in Illinois. So I'd be curious how the legislators are going to reconcile that information as it comes to each state.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What's
Yeah,
the
you can-
process? How will we know what they're doing with the data? Like, will we be able to see those maps as they're creating them?
That's a very good question. No, it hasn't traditionally been a process that has included us. So no, not necessarily. The process that I mentioned is being led by legislators. So unless they are ensuring that there is transparency in that process, no, you won't necessarily be able to see them. We also, another point I wanted to mention was our prison gerrymandering work. In our Fair Maps Amendment, we included an end to prison gerrymandering, which is a process of folks that are incarcerated downstate being counted as residents. I shouldn't say downstate, that are housed in prisons across the state of Illinois are being counted in those communities, which inflates the population because they don't, those are not their home addresses. And in fact, about 60% of the folks who are incarcerated in Illinois prisons reside in Cook County. So it provides false representation. Because of the passing of HB 3653, sorry about that, 3653, which was the Black Caucus Omnibus Bill, the ending of prison gerrymandering was in that bill. So we are excited and hopeful that Illinois will become the 10th state to end prison gerrymandering and end that practice that is inequitable once the governor signs that into law.
Yeah, Lily, do you know if when JB signs that bill, is that effective immediately? So it will have an impact on this gerrymander?
So that's a good question. We're going through, I'm part of the another coalition, the Illinois Breathe Out Coalition, and we're going through each item on that bill to see when effective dates are. But for prison gerrymandering, that would be for this redistricting year.
So I'm trying to understand if we're participating in this map making procedure, we're doing that in the hope that whatever we draw and submit will be considered by the legislature.
Correct.
Is that the point?
Correct. Yeah. I'm going to share the actual interface so that you see it in real time. Just give me 1 second. There we go. So once you can either go to We Draw the Line, the link that I provided, or representable.org and click on Get Started. In the very bottom here, it says Add My Community. You choose the state you reside in. Gives a background on redistricting news in Illinois. What's the criteria for the map drawing in Illinois? The definition of community of interest, and on the bottom here you see start mapping. So you click on that. You have to sign up and log in to create a profile, and it'll go through those steps that I mentioned in the presentation, where you provide your information. It gives you an option to include your address, and then it zooms into the map. Give me 1 second. I'm going to try to do a option to log in. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not sure why that's not working. Yep. In the presentation, the slides that I provided is exactly the options on the website here. So what I would encourage you all, the action step that we hope for community is that they log on and they create their communities of interest maps and advocate to their legislators why it's important to keep your communities intact. And if it's not, that's fine, right? I don't think anyone on this call believes that it's not important to keep their communities intact. I think in the past, when folks haven't been able to be engaged in that process, it was intimidating. It truly is actually intimidating to think about, well, what kind of tools do I have to be able to affect any change? And this is a tool that really can help affect change if there are maps being drawn in communities and showing census blocks that legislators can use, and then can also use that information for map making tools like the district jar and Dave's redistricting that is a map making tool. Yes.
Lily, if you want, you've got a lot of links in this page here. If this is a page that we could distribute, if you could email it to me, then I will send it out to everybody that's signed up. So everybody, you can just have these links, because there's a lot to copy here.
Yeah, there are. It's a PDF follow-up PDF that I sent post the presentation that gives you information on what is gerrymandering and some examples of videos and resources, examples of odd ward shapes in Chicago, an odd shape in Illinois, which ends up being used too often. For those of you who are familiar with the earmuffs district, that is the 4th congressional district.
Now, would that be considered compact?
So that district gets used falsely as a gerrymander district, saying, well, this is an odd shape, so there must be a gerrymander. And an odd shape does not mean that it's a gerrymander. And the reason that it's an odd shape is because it created a unity between two communities of interest, the Latino community in Chicago and the north and south part of Chicago and west part of just outside of Chicago, that ensure the protection of the Black community in the middle of that district, so that they couldn't draw a district to cut into the Black community, because that would violate the Illinois Voting Rights Act and violate the protection of that community and representation. So it ends up being an odd shape, but also unites with two communities of interest that share a common language, similar cultural identity, and ended up with that odd shape. So I have a link.
Okay.
But the point is that compact isn't necessarily a good requirement then.
Well, correct. I mean, in the amendment that we had, we provided a criteria by preference in order. So the first order is to obviously abide by the Federal and Illinois Voting Rights Act and to ensure accurate representation. So compactness was a little bit lower on that criteria.
Very good. Now, but getting back to these links, we have a PDF document. The links in the PDF document are active links. So, Jim, we already have this PDF document. That's correct, right? The links in the PDF are active links, right? Lily?
Yes.
Okay, so Jim, we already have this document. We can send this out.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Lily,
Yes.
when you, let's say you make a map, are you able to see other ones that have been made up, where you might be doing the same area to kind of see how other people are identifying their area of interest when it's by yours? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do know what you're saying. So Change Illinois, because we're essentially the clearinghouse, we're the partner organization in Illinois with Representable, we'll be able to see those maps, and we can download them and provide them to organizations that want to see a unity within their community. or you, as a member of NWSOFA, can lead an organization option on representable, and then say everyone from this community draw maps, and then you are able to download that information within that community. But because there's so many, everyone lives in different parts in the membership coalition, you wouldn't necessarily be able to see other maps that were drawn. But you can ask us, like, are there other maps drawn within this community? And we would be able to share that with you.
Okay. One other question. If, really, I think HR 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act should hopefully go through. Now, will that impact this year on this redistricting? Oh, it won't.
I don't know when it goes into effect, but I know that Illinois has traditionally followed both the Illinois and the Federal Voting Rights Act. So I can't imagine that they would go against those protections to draw the maps.
And those federal legislation
you.
is not going to go through unless we kill the filibuster. You're not going to get that stuff through a reconciliation. And you're not going to get it without killing the filibuster.
Lily, I have a question. How many people even know about this activity that they can participate in? And I mean, this is the first I've heard of it, and I've lived in Illinois all my life. And I'm just wondering how many people actually submit maps, or how many have submitted them so far, let's say. I'm just curious.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the reason you're hearing this for the first time is because this is our Plan B effort after the Fair Maps Amendment failed, to really make sure that there is still transparency and still involvement from community. And so not many. There are three of us who are providing, three of us on staff, two of us that are providing consistent presentations on a weekly basis with different community groups across the state of Illinois. Right now we have about 15 maps, but it's been early in presentation timeline for us because of the elections and the pandemic. I mean, it's been such a competing year for a lot of folks. And, we've been talking about redistricting for over a year, but now that it's a redistricting year, I think obviously more people are paying attention because it's happening more in real time than a year and a half ago when we were communicating about our redistricting efforts. So if you know of any other organizations or any other groups that you would find value in knowing about this information, I would encourage you to contact me so that we can schedule something with that organization or that group, so that people know that this is a tool that they can use free of charge. It's out of the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, and then they can, it's user friendly, so they can essentially use that and share that information to friends as well. I think, Kathy, if you know about the tool, then you know about it, and that's one more person within your community, and you can share that information as well.
I have a question.
Yes.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the ways that gerrymandering works is by taking people from the majority party and grouping them all, packing them into one district. If we go and draw our lines around all the people who are like us, won't we do that? Won't we won't the result be kind of like a gerrymandered district if we try to group ourselves with people who are like us? Or is there some rail to keep us from doing that, an accident?
Well, I mean, you define your community, so you're defining what people you value within your own community. Again, this isn't a tool to draw legislative districts. This is a tool to define communities, to inform how the drawing of the legislative districts are. I think when we are asked about, well, the fourth congressional district, isn't that gerrymandered by race? Well, there's never been a representation that was the first representative district that was Latino majority in the state of Illinois and in the Midwest. And we still only have one. And the population for Latinos in Illinois has increased drastically. That we might see another district that is a Latino representative. But until we get to a point where all of our districts are representative of communities, what we can do as an organization is to advocate for folks to define what their communities are like and or how they define their communities, and if that is by similarities, and that's not for us to decide how to define your community, right? If I align with a culture or a language identity, I had an example of a person who had mentioned that their community is not necessarily defined by a specific war boundary, that it's more by streets, and what streets are safe to them. So I don't believe that we get to decide, we as an organization or change it to decide how people value their own communities and how they define their own communities.
I'd like to address this question as well. There's really two different things that happen in gerrymandering. One is called packing, the other is called cracking. Cracking is taking a community and splitting it up so that it does not have political power. And when we define our communities, we're trying to indicate this is a community we do not want to see cracked. That's not the same as packing to stop somebody else's power. It's to maintain the power of a community and stop it being cracked.
I have a question.
Yes, Ken.
I think what you're doing is very important, but from a national perspective, is the perspective that since Illinois is a Democratic controlled state, that whatever happens with redistricting, it's not likely to be a huge disadvantage to the Democratic Party, and that the biggest concern about redistricting is in states that are controlled by Republicans? What's you guys' position on redistricting nationally?
Yeah, absolutely. So we, as a nonpartisan organization, we believe that gerrymandering and partisan gerrymandering shouldn't happen no matter what party is in control. Now, what we've seen are examples of extreme partisan gerrymandering in other states, and that ended up being a roadblock for us in Illinois because, Illinois is blue, so it wasn't a priority from other national organizations as opposed to other states that had more extreme partisan gerrymandering from the Republican end. But listen, when I hear that question, and generally I think about Illinois, we've seen gerrymandering happen on both ends of the aisle. We are seeing legislators muddle the trust in Illinoisans, and on both aisles. And I think it's important to note that if we fix the foundation of how to redistrict in an equitable way, in a fair way, and to ensure that there is representation, that voices aren't being silenced, then if we fix that foundational aspect of it, then we prevent either party really using the tool of gerrymandering, which the Republican Party has used arguably more effectively in keeping control and choosing their voters. And in Illinois, we have examples of the same thing happening in Illinois and in Chicago, and to ensure incumbency and ensure that we don't have competitive elections. So this is more of a foundational fix, and change is not in support of any partisan gerrymandering, no matter who ends up doing it. And we're also in a state that's voted #1 most corrupt state in the country. We have a city that's voted #2 most corrupt city in the country. We have legislators who have federal indictments, and they're all Democrats. So, you know, we've seen both parties not essentially not doing right what their oath was called to do, was to ensure that they are representative of their constituents and following the Constitution and X, Y, and Z. We're seeing that both happen. The first time I was in Springfield, I saw a representative. The breaking news was that the Representative Arroyo was being charged by the FBI. So we're just trying to fix a foundational issue and include community input and encourage community input in a process, no matter who controls it. And in Illinois, there's a potential that this coin flip will give either party a 50-50% opportunity to lead the map drawing if they do not agree on the map, and the governor does vetoes the map that they don't agree on.
This is another area where I need to make a comment. We measure the effectiveness of gerrymandering by what we call a seat gap, which is the difference between how the general population is voting, like for the governor, and how the legislature ends up. And when you measure the U.S. House of Representatives after the 2018 midterms, the seat gap was 0. The blue states had gerrymandered just enough to offset the gerrymandering in the red states. So both parties do this.
Ed, talk about
Thank you.
Wisconsin.
Well, Wisconsin does it very severely. The seat gap is enormous in Wisconsin. You've got a Democratic governor, and the House is strongly Republican, and that's all due to gerrymandering. But nationally, the gerrymandering on the blue states and the red states has balanced out. At least that happened in the 2018 U.S. House. So both parties do it. Some parties do it more effectively in some states. Some parties do it more in other states. Illinois and California are heavily gerrymandered for the blue side.
That's in the federal. The point is, the state houses, the GOP is much more seriously gerrymandered than the Democrats.
I agree with that. I agree with that. The GOP has been fortunate to be in control at the time of redistricting in a lot of states. And in fact, just now, in this election we just had, while Biden won the presidency, the GOP won a lot of the down ballot races. And in a lot of parts of the country, they're going to be in control during redistricting again. Darn it.
Yes, darn it to that. Again, it's one of the gerrymandering is such a practice that has been slipped under our noses, and one party just happened to be way better and figured that out sooner.
Liliana, there was a question in the chat a while ago. You mentioned that we'll probably lose some representation. The question was, just do you have any idea where?
Yeah, so we're tracking population of loss in Illinois in general as a whole state, but we're seeing swaths of people being displaced, primarily in Cook County, of communities of color, and specifically Black communities. The census, when we were tracking the census numbers and trying to see how folks have been, population sizes have been shifting, we were able to get a little bit more data about what districts will see a dip in overall population. So I can send that information because I don't have the specific districts offhand, but I think we'd be curious to see if we lose a second congressional seat or not. And I believe that's downstate. Yeah, I see the question, if there any thought being given to a nonpartisan commission. Yeah, that was our whole effort as an organization. We were pushing the Fair Maps Amendment for a nonpartisan independent commission that was very similar to California's. We just did not get enough support and did not get enough support from the Democrats. So I think it's really hard to give up power in a process that that people have been traditionally in charge of. But now with everything going on in Springfield, we are just we're waiting to see what that process is going to look like, and looking at who has been named the head of the redistricting committee, and how we're able to work with them, because that ship has sailed. The independent commission, for unless the leaders decide that this is something that they want to push, but I don't think that's going to happen.
I'm a little confused because HR 1 does have in it that there would be independent citizen commissions to draw congressional districts. That would be part of the reforms in HR 1. And one thing I read said that could be applied this year. So are you guys pushing for HR 1 to pass, or does that not give enough? Is that not what we need?
Change Illinois isn't pushing HR 1. We're pushing at the states. We're pushing for there to be transparency and more public meetings. But we haven't gotten any indication that that is something that legislative leaders are interested in.
Right, but okay, but HR 1, if we push our representatives to vote for HR 1, and if HR 1 mandates independent citizens commissions to draw congressional districts, isn't that getting you what we need?
I think in theory, but I just don't know how much time that's going to be, is going to provide by the deadline of June 30th of this year.
Lily, this is Carrie. Can you
Yes.
hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. This presentation has been most excellent, and I've really gleaned a lot of, I've taken copious notes. I am downstate. I am way downstate in Southern Illinois, and it is rapidly turning red. We lost a lot of down ballot races this year, which had been traditionally Democrat, and now they're Republican. We are so interested in the redistricting here. And so I have two questions for you. One is, does the size of the community of interest, is there any size parameters or geographical constraints there? And the second question is, for group submission of this, does that carry greater weight or impact with legislators?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear did you say groups?
Yeah. So if I, instead of myself putting together a submission, a map of community of interest, if I collaborated with several organizations here in my area who would be very interested in submitting communities of interest, would it have greater impact if this is submitted with a long list of signatures of people in the area who want this to be considered a community of interest versus just me submitting it?
Yeah, of course. In theory, yes, right. The more pressure within the community from the very people that end up voting for that legislator, the better. And the people and the will of the people, I think, is very powerful, because those are the voters. Those are the people that end up choosing who holds that seat. And the other question about the size. There is not a limit of how you draw your community, but the limitation would be that if you're drawing a community that's so large that would not fit in the requirement for population size, and then they would it would end up having to be cut up in a way to be in equal population for the rest of the legislative districts.
Okay, thank you very much. That makes total
Sure.
sense.
Sure.
Lily, there's a question. There's a
Yes.
question in the chat. It says, as I understand, California changed to a more solid blue due to ranked choice voting. Is that a way to proceed?
We haven't taken a position on ranked choice voting, and to be fair, we don't. I don't have enough knowledge in ranked choice voting because we have been so focused on redistricting. But we hear cases on preference for ranked choice voting. We just, as an organization, we haven't taken a position. Detroit did that as well. And provided more I'm sorry, not Detroit. There was a city outside of Detroit that successfully had ranked choice voting and saw more representation in their communities. So I apologize. I don't have enough information to answer that. And I know that change isn't, it's not that we're not interesting per se, but there's three of us, and the heavy lift on redistricting has been plenty.
RCV is really a quite separate issue from redistricting and gerrymandering. It's gotten some traction at the city level. There's a tiny bit of traction at the state level in Maine, but I don't know that it's been all that effective. I'd be interested in hearing more about it in California. I heard about it in Minneapolis pretty effectively. So I'd like to hear more about it in California, but it's off topic for this meeting.
Lily, for the recording, could you stop sharing so we get everybody's picture on the screen? Thank you.
I believe I did stop sharing. I don't have a link.
You're still sharing.
I am?
I was seeing the change in Illinois representable redistricting presentation. PDF.
I see. You know what? It's a PDF. I'm so sorry. I don't know how to. My little green option.
Can we rip the sharing away from her?
Yeah, there you go.
Christine, can you take care of that?
Interesting. So, all right. She's okay. We're sharing a file. There it goes.
I did it, but I shared my screen. Well, now it's back to her. What the heck?
Yeah, we need to stop sharing a file. Oh well, we'll have to try this again with the next recording.
I'm so sorry because I don't even see a stop share option.
Yeah, I know. I'll have to look into how to do it.
Damn it, I should not have shared the file. Sorry, guys.
I'll look it up.
Okay, are there any other questions for Lily while she's still here?
Well, I appreciate the conversation. I'm going to put my email in the chat box here. And the day, it makes me very happy that it's 8 o'clock and my son is also asleep. So this was wonderful. I'm really glad I should do this more often. I appreciate all of your time and your questions, and I hope that you all engage in drawing your communities of interest and advocate to your legislators why that's important.
And I would like to Lily, I really thank you for taking the time to educate us on this. And I will get this sheet that's on the screen. I will send that out to everybody. Just don't forget, if anybody's interested in any of the groups, the issue groups that I talked about at the beginning of the meeting, please you can contact me, contact Ed, go to our OFA, NWSOFA.org website and just request information. So our goal is education for all these different issues.
Everyone have a wonderful night. Happy New Year.
Thank you. Thank you. Bill, do you have anything you'd like to close with? Any other comments about anything else for NWSOFA? Nope. Bill's in Florida, so maybe he's on the beach. I don't know. So
I'm sorry. I was I was on mute. No, I did. Jim, you summed it up really well. Our main goal is education and involvement in getting people active. I will segue a little bit here and say that in a couple months, on April 6th, we're going to have a lot of local elections. And what we really need to be focused on at that time is getting people active in their communities to vote for local elections, particularly progressives, liberals, Democrats. And to that point, this next week on Thursday, we're going to start a weekly tweet storm, profiling candidates, and then tweet storming into their areas using their hashtags, etc., in multiple areas at the same night. And we have had a lot of good success and experience in the virus-free voting this year in Illinois, and then we turned our efforts into Georgia, the Senate runoff there, and we believe we had a great impact down there also. So if anybody is interested in that, we're going to start that on Thursday, 6 to 8 o'clock. And you don't have to know anything. We'll teach, we'll help people. There, you can just be like me, a retweeter. You just jump on other people's tweets, add some little comments, and away you go.
Bill,
but our goal is to activate people.
Is that a statewide effort or just like Northwest Suburbs?
It is a NWSOFA, that's our Northwest Suburbs OFA here, principle, but we're tying in with Indivisible, Illinois, but not universally. There are certain chapters that are picking it up as they have been before. And then Ballot Z, which is Gretchen's group, is really promoting it also. And Justin with NWSOFA on Conversation Z. Both of them focus at the young voters, are doing interviews and will be profiling candidates also. Again, we're trying to get that lift from, in local elections, typically we have 14 to 17% of the eligible electorate voting. In this last election, we had 71%, in some areas even higher. So just that little difference will assure that we get a good democratic turnout and candidates elected. So we're really excited about that. While all of our issue teams are working on all their issues every week and every month, this is something that anybody who wants to spend just a couple hours a week getting a great impact that's available.
So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us tonight. I hope everybody learned what they were hoping to learn, and I will send that PDF sheet out to everybody. And Lily put her email address in the chat if you want to grab it before we close the meeting.